We spent £2.3 billion on temporary accommodation in England last year. Around £700 million of that went to hotels and bed and breakfasts, widely acknowledged as being among the least suitable forms of accommodation and the most expensive. In addition, money which was in many cases earmarked for prevention actually went towards temporary accommodation as well. So these are two particular examples of why much of that spending does not constitute value for money. A few years ago, the key financial risk pressures on local authorities stemmed from adults and children's social care. Today, homelessness spending has joined, for many local authorities, adults and children's social care as a key financial risk. And this is in a world where many local authorities are facing the risk of Section 114 notices, which is basically bankruptcy for the public sector. Demand for temporary accommodation has risen significantly in England in recent years. Today, there are more than 117,000 households in temporary accommodation, by far the largest number we've ever seen. And for many people experiencing homelessness, the reasons why they become homeless are the same as we've always seen, such as the breakdown of a relationship or the end of a tenancy. But one thing that's striking from the work we've done is that many local authorities report that the needs of people approaching them as homeless have become more complex in recent years, and this makes the job of local authorities in finding accommodation for these people a lot more challenging. English local authorities are in many cases facing extreme pressures from rising numbers in temporary accommodation. There are no silver bullets to this. However, we found with our work, in every local authority we've worked with, that their ability to respond to these pressures can be made more agile by an improved use of data and taking a more strategic, governance-led approach. There is a key role for national government here. At national level, we think government needs to put in place a strategy for temporary accommodation. There is no strategy for temporary accommodation, unlike for rough sleeping. There needs to be a plan which sets out responsibilities and roles for various departments across government. In addition, there's a job for government to do to assess all of the funding streams it uses to go to local authorities to tackle homelessness, to establish which are the most effective. And finally, I think there's a job for MHCLG to do to ensure that the data standards being followed in local authorities are as high as they need to be to tackle this issue.
That was Matt Wilkins, our head of value for money at the centre, who has managed to join us today. He's just back there for everyone. Perfect. So just a bit about the centre. We are part of the UK What Works network. We are an independent charity and work with local and national governments and those working in the sector to ensure policy decisions, funding decisions, practice decisions are underpinned by evidence and data. And hopefully this phrase will be familiar to a few of you. We see this increasingly being used by national and local governments, which is a sign of really encouraging progress. At the centre, our vision is that homelessness is prevented whenever possible. And when it's not, it's a brief occurrence and it's a rare. And when people do experience homelessness, they are supported out of the system so they don't experience it again. A little bit about the programme. So we launched our Value for Money programme at the start of last year, and Matt Wilkins joined us from the National Audit Office. And the programme is based on 3 principles. So the first one is economy. How can we spend less? Efficiency. How can we spend the same but in a better way? And effectiveness. How can we use money to get better outcomes? And that last one is really important because it's not just about driving the cost down, although that's great when we're trying to get politicians to the table. It's also trying to get better outcomes for people. And as we confront, obviously, the increasing challenge of homelessness in England, tackling the urgent issue of temporary accommodation has become essential. So that's the reason we chose it as the first area of focus for the programme. And the purpose of this work is to find the issues that local authorities are facing in delivering value for money in temporary accommodation. But it's also about working with local and national governments on potential solutions. So some stats, I know some of this has been covered already, but it's always nice to see them in graph form. So in March this year, more than 1,017 households in England were resident in TA. And within this, 1,501 and 630 children were living in temporary accommodation. And in terms of increases, this was a 120 increase since December 2010. And within this, we see the number of families in B&B accommodation has increased rapidly. On the graph on the left, we see the striking spike in the last couple of years, and the one in red is with children, and it's more than 6 weeks, and then the one in black is in the total. Within this, we also see an increase in the amount of out-of-area placements that show that in December last year, 36,360 households were living in temporary accommodation placed in a different local authority. It's important to state the majority of this is in London. However, we are seeing increasingly that this is happening in other major cities in the UK. So, for example, we have seen this in Manchester City as well. And for many households, temporary accommodation is anything but temporary. And the situation for families is particularly dire, with extended stays in bed and breakfast accommodation becoming very common. Despite it being unlawful for local authorities to place families in bed and breakfast for more than 6 weeks, the number of these households had reached 550 in 2021 to 3,250 in March this year. That represents a 491 increase. But it is also important to state that temporary accommodation or emergency accommodation, whatever we want to call it, is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. We as a society have a safety net and support system to support people in crisis. And, you know, if we look at other developed nations such as the US, they do not have the same protections. And that is something to be proud of in itself. However, in the midst of increasing homelessness and the greater demand on temporary accommodation, we need to ensure that resources are deployed as effectively as possible, and that vision of preventing homelessness whenever possible, making it a brief, rare, and non-recurring experience is top of our minds. So last month we published our report on the value for money of TA in England, making recommendations to the UK government and local authorities. This was the culmination of probably a year and a half working with local authorities across the country. And the main methods of this work were analysis of published data, so looking at HCLIC data, looking at temporary accommodation data, looking at published cost data. We also conducted case studies, so this included interviews with frontline staff and leadership teams. We also visited temporary accommodation, including B&Bs, private let accommodation, a variation of accommodation, and we also conducted interviews with people with lived experience of homelessness who were resident in temporary accommodation. And finally, we managed to get local authority internal kind of financial data and had a look at temporary accommodation and homelessness strategies. So in terms of the areas we worked with, this is a list. We worked with Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, BCP, Southend, Newcastle, Greater Manchester. So that's a combined authority. We worked with the combined authority, and we also worked with Manchester City, Bolton, Rochdale and Salford. And we worked with Hackney, where we are. With all these local authorities, we carried out evidence sprints. So this was looking at their local issues, the data they were collecting, mapping it against household types, temporary accommodation types, move-on destinations, and really looking at where the opportunities were to improve. So, some findings. So key value for money points on spending on temporary accommodation. So as a number of people have said today, spending on temporary accommodation is now at the highest level ever. It's at 2.3 billion annually. And local authorities acknowledge that spending overall does not constitute value for money. Within this spending, there is 700 million annually spent on hotels and B&Bs. And it's widely acknowledged this is the poorest form of TA for households resident in temporary accommodation and the most costly. Getting a soundtrack there. And the graph on the right shows that whilst we've seen this gross spending increase, we've also seen net spending increase. So this is the shortfall that local authorities need to take on themselves. And as someone spoke about, this is because LHA rates are still set at the one-bedroom amount set in 2011. So this means that the financial burden is really coming to local authorities. And in fact, through B&B use, the DWP, they are paying less from their own kind of budgets. And sadly, it also means that money that should be going to prevention is often going to temporary accommodation. Currently, the homelessness prevention grant isn't ring-fenced by government, so that means, particularly in this time of crisis, for local authorities under real pressure, they are having to use that money on temporary accommodation. And as Matt said in the video there, this is starting to be a key strategic risk for local authorities. For a number of years, local authorities have been in an unstable position, and that's been to increase costs of adult and children's social care. However, we are seeing spending on temporary accommodation now sitting along this pressure. So in terms of key points about demand pressures on local authorities, one subject we've spoken about a lot today is the PRS and the limited supply that local authorities are facing through that. That has two effects. That's been the increase in homelessness due to loss of private rented accommodation, so often due to Section 21, so no-fault evictions. But the other is the reduced ability of local authorities to prevent homelessness by placing families in the PRS or relieving homelessness in the PRS. Alongside the PRS, there's also been an unprecedented increase in the number of presentations through home office accommodation. And then this graph shows the result of policy decision made last year to reduce the days of notice given from 28 days to 7 days. And this is something that no local authorities predicted, and many are really seeing it through presentations and local authority levels. There's also been an increase in B&B and nightlies and emergency rooms. And as Matt said in the video, a number of local authorities we visited and we saw temporary accommodation, they had emergency rooms. And these were for, you know, a family had turned up in the middle of the night and there needs to be a room there for a day or 2 days. These rooms were often filled. And that just shows how pressured the system is right now. In terms of invest to save case, this was a lot of the conversation we had with local authorities. They were desperate to be able to get that conversation. And a lot of the times we found ourselves in meetings and they'd invited finance colleagues along. They were trying to show that, you know, temporary accommodation spending doesn't mean value for money, and, you know, they wanted to build other TA accommodation or wanted to spend more on prevention. However, what we found is, particularly in terms of prevention, they don't have the data to make that argument to their finance colleagues. In terms of complexity of needs, this is something we spoke a lot about with staff as well, that people that were approaching them, they had never seen people with such complex needs. It wasn't just housing, it was mental health, it was debt, it was alcohol and drug dependencies. And there was a feeling that, you know, there was a lack of kind of resource and qualified staff there to support with this. And interestingly, we have seen statistical evidence for this in the stats. So since 2018, we've seen a decrease in the number of people found to be owed a homelessness prevention or relief duty as having no support needs. So this fell. But for those who had at least one support need, or those had 3 or more support needs, we have seen this increase. And for the latter, there's been a 46% increase over the 4 years in those with 3 or more support needs owned by homelessness prevention or relief duty. Why this is, it may be because people are more confident and informed in expressing their needs. Local authority staff can recognise these needs. Other services and sectors are under strain, but the complex of needs facing frontline staff is clear to see. And many consider, and I'm sure like those in the room today have had these conversations, but, you know, senior leaders are telling us this is the toughest time they have ever seen. They can't envisage it getting any tougher. However, some are, in spite of these barriers, and I do say that because it is in spite of these barriers, are finding solutions and having an impact on their numbers and costs, and finding a bit of breathing space in the short term. So the ability of local authorities to respond to increased homelessness pressures. Many told us they feel like they're firefighting in the middle of an increase they didn't predict. And this is partly due to the limited options available to them. We've obviously spoken about the increased private sector rents, the reduced number of social lets available following decades of sales of house stock under right to buy legislation. And because of this limited stock, we can see local authorities across the country breaking the 6-week rule in B&Bs. The graph on the right reflects this, where we can see that the steepest increase has been in B&Bs, nightly paid accommodation, and social housing as well. In addition, some local authorities we are speaking to are actually struggling to retain B&B contracts, and they are looking to more commercial, expensive hotels to fulfill their duties. And lastly, there is a lack of data, and that's coming up again and again. And part of this is being highlighted, I guess, through the introduction of the Homelessness Reduction Act in 2018. So that required local authorities to submit data on costs and numbers. But because of this, we find that local authorities are using a number of different systems that aren't linked up, and therefore they aren't able to gain that data and knowledge on the reasons for why people are presenting. And I touched on this briefly, but many local authorities are not strategically set up to respond. And homelessness and housing are often not considered strategic leadership priorities. Our visits, in a surprising way, have been almost used as a catalyst to get the right people in the room. And whilst that's encouraging for us as an organisation, it shouldn't take an external charity to come in for that to be the case. We have also seen that local authorities' ability to respond varies dramatically depending on where they are in the country. So whilst TA numbers are significantly higher in London, because it's been a longer problem, and I guess you could say London local authorities have more sophisticated ways of dealing with temporary accommodation, they've managed to kind of drive down the prices from suppliers. You see, local authorities in Yorkshire, in the East Midlands, in the Southwest, they are relying heavily on B&B right now. In terms of recommendations, so for the national government, 2 points we've outlined in the report is, and we saw it with the previous government, there was a real focus there in ending rough sleeping. And there still isn't a strategy for all forms of homelessness, which includes temporary accommodation. So that really needs to be a first step in terms of outlining what to do next and where do we see ourselves? What is the ambition for this? Alongside this, we've recommended to conduct a review of funding streams. So this includes, the prevention stream I referenced there, to establish to what extent support is effective and the financial sustainability of local authorities. For MHCLG, I loved it when they were called DLUC. It was a lot easier to say. But the first step is establishing quality standards, and I know we've spoken about that a lot in the last panel discussion. And we have reference in the report to look at other nations, like for example Scotland, who have an unsuitable accommodation order, and take learning from that and seeing what is working, but also what isn't working in other nations. The second point is promoting higher standards of data on the cost and use of temporary accommodation. There are significant gaps there, and if central government don't have the right data, how can they make the right policy decisions? And finally, assessing the complexity of need of people experiencing homelessness. We talk about overall numbers in B&B and temporary accommodation, but this, whilst it's temporary, needs to suit the needs of people staying in there. And in terms of recommendations to local authorities, the first one is to review data LAs hold on the cost and use of TA and assess whether the approach that they are taking is equivalent with the scale and risk of it. They need to explicitly address and plan for TA needs in local housing supply strategies. So increasingly we are seeing TA action plans and things like that coming through, which is really encouraging. And finally, maximise the effectiveness of existing TA. We have seen on our visits that whilst in some ways for the economy they are spending less on TA, there are questions that come out about what are the outcomes of this TA and are we likely to see these households come round again in the system. So in terms of potential solutions, because I'll leave it on a more positive note, there are no silver bullets. I wish there was. There's no magical invest to save case. However, there are huge variations in how local authorities are responding, and some are bringing spending under control. They're having a bit of breathing space, and our work has strived to kind of help them understand the data and where the gaps are and identify even short-term, medium-term solutions. Finally, and these 3 case studies are included in our report, and something we are looking to now is to accumulate a bank of promising practice, particularly in kind of TA provision and value for money. But I just wanted to pull out, so in terms of BCP, Matt and I actually had a call with them last week, which was positive, which was really nice. They said despite increasing presentations, they have managed to dramatically reduce their B&B use, particularly for families. And their focus has been increasing TA supply in more kind of the private rental sector, so a better quality TA, and also restructuring their frontline teams to improve pathways. So there's more of a immediate focus when people come to their doors on, can this be prevented? And if not, what is the best TA for you? And how can we move you through the system as quickly as possible? In terms of Greater Manchester, our work specifically focused with them about out-of-borough accommodation. So as they have a number of local authorities, they had seen that LAs were starting to be quite competitive with one another in terms of trying to get that temporary accommodation, and through that they were distorting each other's housing markets. So through our work last year, they are looking to work better together, and I think are now have a plan to undertake a kind of TA spend analysis, so they can kind of see where the gaps are in the combined authority, and work better in a more collaboratively way. And finally, in Hackney, at the start of this year, we worked with senior leadership to bring the housing and the homelessness teams together, to recognise that often the issues that they are battling are, there's a crossover, and there's real similarities there, and they're kind of looking to increase the supply of temporary accommodation from B&Bs to other better quality and more value for money TA. So just some concluding thoughts. TA numbers are highest ever recorded and are likely to rise further. For many, this is anything but temporary, and the cost of TA has risen so rapidly, it presents a financial risk to LAs. Funding is not going on prevention, and that really needs to be at the top of our minds, because we need to stop that flow into TA. And long-term solutions, as we've discussed today, really do require structural changes, and that housing supply really does need to be increased. But immediate action can be taken by local and national government, and that is in the form of strategic planning and improving understanding and use of data. Thank you.